Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be looking at the aspects of comedy course for the A level. This is Literature Spec B. And I'm going to be looking at three questions that have come up in past papers using the importance of being earnest and AQA's poetry anthology in order to think about how we might answer the questions. To do so, I'm just focusing in this video on planning answers, which I do a lot of with students actually. Sometimes students don't need to write the whole essay. Sometimes they just need to plan what they're going to say or would say in an essay in order to revise the texts and understand the requirements of the question. So the key thing, of course, for Literature Spec B is to answer the question and use your texts to discuss the question that you're given. Section C will require you to use two texts. Some of you might be doing the tragedy course, some of you might be doing the comedy course, but regardless of the type of module you're doing, Section C will require you to look at two texts, and that's why I've got two texts here on the front of this screen. So very simply in this video, I'm going to be going through this grid with you, and these questions at the top have all been questions that have been asked in this section over the last kind of 8 or so years. And you can see that what's going to happen as this video progresses is I'm going to talk you through 3 paragraphs in terms of what you could say in order to answer this question using Earnest and the poetry to do so. So the first question I'm going to be looking at is, in comedy texts, men are always ridiculed and used as figures of fun. To what extent do you agree? So whenever you see a question that finishes with "to what extent do you agree," it means that you can engage in a disagreement with the question, in fact, and you can actually say, well, actually, sometimes men are used as more serious devices, maybe in some texts, to present a certain message. So it's up to you to decide how men are presented, if you're going to agree or disagree. Are men always presented as ridiculous and figures of fun or not? So I always say to students, or I always plan with students, 3 paragraphs, but of course the mark scheme makes absolutely no reference to how many paragraphs students write. The two things are to answer the question and to talk about 2 texts, and if you do that, you will be in line with the requirements of this question. So hypothetically, let's imagine that this was the question you got in the exam. The first paragraph, you might want to talk about Ernest, and you might want to talk about the character of Algernon, who is a character who's representative of a lovable rogue figure and a clownish figure who delights and entertains. And using those words like delights and entertains are always convenient in comedy because, of course, that's why a lot of the time comedy is written to entertain. And that's why, theatre goers and people that watch sitcoms or read comic novels, whatever, feel like they're getting their money's worth. It's because they are being delighted and entertained. So that's a common effect of comedy. Specifically, you could mention how in Act 2 of the play, Algy begins to Bunbury, or doesn't begin to Bunbury, but at least continues to Bunbury, as he pretends to be Jack's brother Ernest at the manor house. So I would use that word shenanigans. He kind of gets engaged in these ridiculous shenanigans. So there's lots of disguise and deception, as you might expect with a comedy. Of course, there's a motivation why Algy is doing this, and there's a kind of an indirect social comment that Wilde is making, that society is full of hypocrites, people that make the rules but actually do as much as they can to break them in secret. And that's, of course, why both Jack and Algy have these double lives. So to Bunbury is another word, it's a neologism or a verb, meaning to seek escapism through the act of disguise. And what Algy is escaping from is polite upper class society, which can be quite restrictive and shallow. So again, Algy could have, you could say, quite unscrupulous behaviour. But because this is a comedy, we know that characters tend to escape scot-free. So even though he's a roguish character and quite unscrupulous, his behaviour is rewarded in the end. So that could be 1 paragraph of your essay. The second paragraph, hypothetically, could be you turn to the poetry anthology and you decide to look at Tam O'Shanter. And Tam O'Shanter, of course, as the name of the poem suggests, we could call it an eponymous poem, meaning it's named after its main character. It's representative of the uncultivated behaviour of the lower social classes. His drunkenness is his main shortcoming, his main foible. And it's because of his excessive drinking, which is why he gets himself into these ridiculous and absurd scenarios with the party in the church and the subsequent chase with the witch. So we tend to see Tam as a foolish figure, and he is ridiculed by the speaker and also potentially by the reader as well for getting into these ridiculous situations. Had he not been so drunk or selfish and ignored Kate's advice, and had he not been so enamoured with the old witch, he might not have been in this ridiculous situation where he's putting his own life at risk. So the speaker is not Tam. The speaker is a separate, omniscient speaker who revels in telling us this story and really foregrounding Tam's buffoonery and his kind of flawed behaviour. But it's the drunkenness which is what causes that behaviour. And of course, at the time, this was a place in Scotland, in the Highlands, as were many places in the world, in the United Kingdom at least, where folklore was popular, where people genuinely believed in witches and the sinister impacts and effects of witches. And what Burns has done is he's really inverted that very sinister connotation of a witch for comedic effect by getting them to basically be having a party with alcohol. And when you have party and alcohol, you get revelry and people having a good time, which is often what comedy can be about. Your third and final paragraph of this essay potentially could be, again, another poem. It could be referring to Not My Best Side and the depiction of the night in that poem, in that third monologue of that poem. So this is, of course, a retelling of the St. George and the Dragon narrative, where we assume that these characters have certain gender roles. So that is what Fanthorpe is being inspired by here. We call that ekphrasis. So a text which is inspired by an existing work of art is called ekphrasis. So the knight is representative here of flawed masculinity and arrogance, and that is shown through the way in which he speaks. He's a bit of a bragger, he's arrogant, he's egotistical, and really, I imagine a modern term that we would use to describe him would be toxic masculinity. He does embody many of the traits now of what modern society would call toxic masculinity. So, what Fanthorpe is doing through the knight as a character is challenging traditional notions of chivalry and heroism, and giving these characters and the knight a different voice, a more colloquial voice. And in so doing, she's also really mocking high art, of which that painting represents. So there we have potentially 3 paragraphs. You're talking about both texts. It doesn't have to be equal treatment, by the way, of each text. It can be, imbalanced slightly. But the most important thing is that you answer the question, are we talking about men here? Yes. Are we talking about men's behaviour as being foolish? Yes. So we're answering the question as well. You don't have to write 3 paragraphs, but in about 50 minutes or so, that can be a realistic aim. Okay, so that could be one example of a plan in terms of what you would say in order to answer this question on men being figures of fun. The second question I'm going to be looking at is the middle one in purple, about this idea that comedy sometimes can be about serious matters, and sometimes comedy does, make a point about something that is more serious. And both Earnest and the poetry do this to varying degrees. So again, let's imagine you want to write 3 paragraphs, and you've got to split those 3 paragraphs between 2 texts. What could you potentially say? Well, you could start this essay with the poetry if you wanted, and you could start by disagreeing with the question and actually say, well, in Swift's satirical elegy, the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, who was regarded as a war profiteer for prolonging the War of Spanish Succession, and kind of profiting from that, is actually a serious matter, because we're talking here about death, and we're talking here about widows and infants and how their lives were ruined essentially by this incompetent man in power. And you could also say that any lesson, because you could say that this poem is didactic, it gives us a lesson about greed and vanity and power, that any lesson which is going to be about those things is going to be serious. This is not kind of a silly, frilly, kind of trivial poem. It's about something actually relatively serious. And that's potentially why Swift has chosen a Juvenalian satire, in order to really make it very clear that the speaker is engaged in this diatribe, which is a fancy word for a rant about this figure. The poem is written in iambic tetrameter, and it has a rhyme scheme. And you could say that represents the monotonous attack of this speaker, who is really kind of destroying this figure's kind of status. And of course, satire is a cornerstone of comedy. We still have satire even today through magazines like Private Eye, whose job is really to mock and make powerful people accountable for their shortcomings. Of course, what Swift believes is that a good society is one that's based on a meritocracy rather than preferment. So, in other words, it's not about what you're born into that makes you powerful. It's actually the hard work and the credits that you've earned. So, your first paragraph could be about satirical elegy. Your second paragraph could also be about a second poem, Sonny Prestatyn, and again we have another poem here which is disagreeing with the question. So it seems that, at least in part, the comedy anthology has poems in it which do actually deal with some more serious matters. And for those of you that are studying the comedy anthology, hopefully you know as to why Sonny Prestatyn would be a good poem for this question. Because on the surface, this poem seems to be quite idealistic and utopian in terms of its depiction of Prestatyn as a holiday resort. But as we get into that second and third stanza, and we start to learn of the reality of the men's behaviour who deface this poster of this girl, that we know actually that this is actually more dystopian and darker than we maybe initially gave the poem credit for. You could say that the title of the poem is ironic because you've got the adjective sunny, and yet there's little sunny or positive about this poem. Essentially, what Larkin is doing is he's saying that because these men couldn't leave this poster alone, it makes a comment about society and it makes a comment on humanity's shortcomings. In other words, we have a problem with beauty. We can't just let something stay beautiful. We've got to bring it down to our level and make it less beautiful than it was. Because it might be something that we associate with. We know, for example, that the advertising and marketing world is fake. It's all an illusion. And that's what this poster represents. So by defacing this poster, it's making us aware that actually there's a conflict here, a disparity between our real lives and also the world that might be depicted in an advertisement. And that's why it says she was too good for this life, meaning that society and humanity is far too flawed to allow this kind of beauty to continue. And as typical for Larkin, we've got this colloquial kind of register, quite abrasive language with undertones of sexual violence and violation slapped up, for example, that verb phrase, which doesn't have very pleasant connotations, does it at all? So, yes, this poem does prove that comedy can sometimes come from the controversial, from the dark subject matter, from what might be called black humour or black comedy, things that maybe don't make our sides split with laughter, but things that are still humorously presented anyway. And of course, at the moment, we haven't followed the requirement of this question. We haven't actually talked about two texts yet because the anthology counts as one. So we have to now make sure that we talk about Earnest. And Earnest here, we could again disagree. So with this essay plan, imagining the student, they are disagreeing completely with this question. And what they're saying is Earnest shows us about the obsession with image and wealth. And that is a serious matter because it's actually a criticism of society rather than something that's quite nonsensical and without any kind of substance. So we know, for example, through the character of Lady Bracknell that she sees marriage, as a money-making activity. That is shown when she interrogates Jack in Act 1, in that kind of interview scene. She also says in Act 3 about Cecily's profile, which is her kind of side view of her face, as if it has social advantage, which is, of course, a bit trivial. She says that Algy has nothing but looks everything. There's that quote about the shallow mask of manners. So the obsession that society has, that the upper class has, and what Wilde is mocking through this Horatian satire indirectly, is how society is obsessed with these things. And therefore, it's a serious comment about society's vanity, you could argue. Both women are, of course, obsessed with the name Ernest, and the more fool them because, as it turns out, they don't realise that they're being lied to at the time. And you could also say that society in this play has a restrictive nature because they are so constrained by giving this mask of manners all the time that it actually prevents them from being honest, and it actually makes them lie and be deceitful and just be a bit fake and superficial as well. And that's because, again, with that image, that obsession with image and wealth. So in those three paragraphs in that essay, the candidate is within their right to completely disagree in in totality. The whole essay is them disagreeing with the task, and that's absolutely fine. You don't always have to agree with it, remember. The final question is about characters who find themselves in difficult situations and predicaments. So in this case, you would have to find um, one or two poems where that happens, and in Earnest, locate a part of the text where a character is in a difficult situation. There are many, otherwise these questions wouldn't get written in the first place. But for Earnest, I think we begin. Yep, we begin with thinking about Gwen and Cecily's afternoon tea in Act 2. There we have that quote, shallow mask of manners. They have to keep their bitterness and their resentment hidden because it would have been unbecoming for them to be outwardly criticising one another. There's lots of euphemism, or as we might say, lots of periphrastic language which exists on the periphery, because they cannot directly insult their opponent, but they do it so through metaphors, such as with comments about spades and how those spades represent social class. And there's also a degree of farce here, of course, because the women believe they're both engaged to the same man. Through the dramatic irony, the audience knows different, and therefore you could link that to the title, the significance of being called earnest, the significance of being earnest, and link that to the pun and the irony, and about how these men seem to be easily deceiving these two women. And there could be more you could say as well, but obviously I'm restricted to space here. But that would be the bare bones of that paragraph potentially. So we are laughing at these characters, Gwen and Cecily, because they're in a difficult situation. They hate each other. The question is, how are they going to show they hate each other without outwardly saying it? So it remains kind of hidden under the surface. You have tea, sugar cubes. You have tea and cake instead of butter, and all of this kind of stuff, or tea cake instead of bread and butter. So it's done indirectly, and the audiences will laugh at that. It's one of the most, I think, hilarious moments of the whole play, is seeing these two female characters passively aggressively, indulging in this battle. The middle paragraph, we could turn to the poetry, and I think in this example I'm only going to be talking about one poem, and that's fine as well. My Rival's House, the very similar to Gwen and Cecily actually in their afternoon tea. Two women again in a spiteful, bitter, and resentful, yet kind of hidden dynamic and relationship. And that house is representative of that rivalry, of course, because they need to coexist in that same setting in order for that rivalry to be apparent. The speaker feels like an outsider. She feels like the mother has all of the power in this domain, and that's probably true, as it's her house, not the daughter-in-law's. And she mocks the status of the mother-in-law through saying things like queen bee, lady of the house. So there's some passive-aggressive insults there as well, spoken quite sarcastically, maybe. And you could say, well, even though, again, this might not be side-splittingly hilarious, it's humorous in the sense that it's relatable. And it's humorous in the sense that this female speaker might be using a bit of hyperbole in terms of catastrophizing, in terms of the way in which she regards the mother-in-law, the comic villain, of course, in this particular setting. So that could be your second paragraph. And your third paragraph in this essay example could be going back to Earnest again. So this is an essay where perhaps there might be more to say for Earnest than poetry. It doesn't matter as long as you talk about both texts in some way. And the final paragraph of this could be how Lady Bracknell interrogates Jack in Act 1 as she tries to find out his money, his class, and his background. She is, of course, representative of the comic villain, a stock character, the overbearing mother-in-law, which has often been a figure of ridicule in comedy for centuries. Lady Bracknell's questions themselves are very trivial. You would think that there are more important questions to ask a prospective son-in-law than do you smoke. That's what she starts with. And there's also details about which side of the street he lives on, all of this, and you would hope that a relationship maybe is not so much based on such material preoccupations. So she has an antagonistic presence. And poor Jack, he stood there, of course, squirming and probably trembling because of the way in which, Lady Bracknell's presence makes him so uncomfortable. He's very much aware that the answers to the questions will make or break his likelihood of getting his love interest. And we know, of course, that this interview doesn't go very well. She says no because it materializes he was found in a handbag at the climax of that scene. So the kind of the engagement, it seems, is off for the time being, at least. So again, we might feel slightly sorry for Jack, but we would also perhaps laugh at the situation that he finds himself in because of his squirming in front of this kind of very domineering mother-in-law character. Okay, so there we have 3 past questions that have come up in the last kind of 8 years or so for section C of paper 1 for aspects of comedy. Remember, 2 important things is to make sure you answer the question and you talk about 2 texts. In this case, the poetry anthology counts as 1 text. You can do 2 poems and 1 point for Earnest, or 3 poems or 1 point for Earnest. There's lots of different combinations. The most important thing, though, is you talk about both texts. Okay, and this, of course, is not an exclusive list. There might be other things you can say. You might want to write 5 paragraphs instead of 3. It's up to you. It depends on what you've been taught. But I think, of course, in 45 minutes, you've got to be realistic about what you can say. And I wouldn't want to overburden my students by saying too much and running out of time. So as long as students know the text very well and talk about 2 texts, they should be absolutely fine with this task in this way. Okay, so thank you very much for watching and good luck in your studies. Thank you.